Well, after 7 months of relative calm, President Donald Trump is now facing what may be his greatest foreign policy challenge to date. What to do with a belligerent and nuclear-capable North Korea. But the test comes in the wake of recent polling showing the president's political standing here at home greatly weakened. VOA National correspondent Jim Malone has our report.
They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
Trump's remarks were unfortunate, says former Ambassador Bill Richardson.
Now I think the president has a chance to rally the nation, to address the country on what our policy is, but most importantly, to calm down.
President Obama, he is the founder of ISIS. He's the founder of ISIS.
Americans got used to Trump's tough rhetoric during last year's election campaign. But now that he's president, the standard is different, says political analyst Larry Sabato via Skype.
He is very impulsive. Now, I suppose you could argue that abroad, that may be a plus when your enemies, when your adversaries think they're dealing with someone who doesn't exactly have a cool head. On the other hand, when you're dealing with nuclear weapons, I'd say it was in everybody's interest, including America's interest, to have someone with a cool head.
But Trump defenders say the blunt warning is what his supporters expect.
So what happens when campaign rhetoric meets international reality? Joining us now to talk more about this, we are joined by VOA National correspondent Jim Malone. Jim Malone, I thank you for helping us out. This is a very sobering topic, but we need to talk about it. President Trump, obviously, rather than softening his fire and fury comments, he seems to be doubling down on that, and he's using loaded words like locked and loaded, we should have been tougher, that sort of thing. Is that a wise tactic politically?
Well, I think it certainly has stirred concern in the international community. It has stirred concern from Democrats, some pushback from Democrats. On the other hand, some Republicans are coming to his defense. Lindsey Graham, no one who's shy to criticize the president thinks the president's rhetoric is generally appropriate because, look, and Trump has made this point himself, predecessors have not been able to deal with the North Korean threat. He is vowing to try to do that, but the language is strong and it is making a number of people uneasy. And also you have this idea of the mixed messages in the administration, where the Secretary of State uses softer language. So that's where we're at.
Because, I mean, you followed the campaign for months. It's kind of a winning strategy when you're talking to your domestic audience, right? I mean, they like to rah-rah.
Well, this is him from the campaign. The question for some is, has he made the transition from saying things on the stump as a candidate, blunt threats, to, okay, you're president now, people are much more interested in what you have to say in detail?
A casual observer would suggest that he has not.
Well, he is. I think the key here is, like with everything that Mr. Trump does, he wants to follow through on being someone who wants to drain the swamp in Washington and upend politics as usual. If you adopt that philosophy, in a way, anything goes. And we have the Trump experience as a businessman, negotiate from a position of strength, sometimes make embellished arguments or claims. You want to be in a position of strength so that you can negotiate something so that you can win. That's the background philosophy.
But Jim Malone is the president operating from a position of strength. I mean, if you to believe the latest polls, 3 out of 4 Americans don't really believe what the White House is saying.
Yeah, this is for the White House, perhaps the unfortunate backdrop here is his support has been sliding. Part of it has to do with the stalled legislative agenda. We've seen the health care thing come unraveled. But also, if you look into these polls, there is an issue of credibility. And that is something that continues to haunt the White House. In some cases, well under 40% of people say the president is honest or trustworthy. That's a consistent theme. And the question is, if you're dealing with an international crisis, and this is his first big international test as president, to what extent does the fact that people may not totally believe you, how does that potentially undermine what you're trying to do and what you're trying to say?
Okay, so Jim Malone, previous presidents have usually dealt with the issue of Pyongyang through a proxy another country perhaps criticizing the country, but have never dealt directly with Kim Jong-un. By doing that, does he raise Kim Jong-un's profile to the same level as a U.S. president? Well,
he may, but I think it's mostly about how he sees his own profile. I think he sees it's very much eccentric to what he does. He's at the center of the universe here politically, and it's most important what he says. You have a number of administration people come out later and try to explain what is being said or try to tamp down the comments. But at the end of the day, they're generally deferential to the commander-in-chief. He was the one who was elected. He was the beneficiary of this revolution to come to power.
So given this ramping up of this rhetoric, does he leave himself any room for a diplomatic solution?
Well, I'm sure in his own mind, it's probably true, because he thinks you start from a position of strength and therefore the other side will eventually get the message and will back off. But look at how other presidents have dealt with things like that. George H.W. Bush, the Persian Gulf War, said very little. And yet was very strong and consistent, as were the people under him in the run-up to that war. This is a much different sort of case example of a president facing a foreign policy crisis.
I got like 15 seconds left, Jim Malone. Do you see comparisons here between the 1962 missile crisis with Cuba?
Well, there are some, although certainly the Soviet threat was much more encompassing. So in that sense, hopefully, sobering minds will prevail.
Never a dull moment here in Washington.
That's
Jim
right.
Malone, thank you so much. And of course, to all our correspondents today, that is our show. Please join us again next week for the final edition of The Correspondents. But before we go, we want to mention that iconic country and pop singer Glenn Campbell, also a star of stage and screen, died this week on August 8th at the age of 81. His death comes after a long battle with Alzheimer's disease. One of the biggest stars of the late 1960s and 70s, Campbell sold more than 45 million records and had 12 gold albums. Glenn Campbell, the Rhinestone Cowboy, 81. I'm Mil Arcega. Thank you for joining us.
Let's hear you loud, like a rhinestone cowboy. Oh yeah, riding out on a horse in the star-spangled road, like a rhinestone cowboy. Yeah. Through cup hands round the tin can, I pretend to hold you to my breast and find